In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to retain cached information within our scenes. Okay, so this scene file is called Lesson 10 Start. And again, just a relatively simple scene. Have a couple of emitters, some gravity, a volume, both of which I currently have set to be invisible. But if I were to come in and press the A key on our keyboard, you can see that we do have a couple of these fluids in here that are mixing and sort of interacting with each other. So what I'm going to do is first give this just a moment to simulate through, because what I want to do is get my cache built up here on my timeline. Okay, so I'll let this simulate through to about frame 80. That should be good enough. So once I have that set, I'll go ahead and now just make my timeline a little bit shorter. So I'll just go ahead and set it to an 80 frame duration, so that way that's my whole timeline. So if we were to scrub through this, you can see all the cached information that has been written out as we have done the simulation. So our particles mixing, we have our particles that are being killed by our hidden volume daemon. Now, there may be any number of situations where we have this information that has now been simulated and cached out, and maybe we actually want to keep this information, but we still want to be able to come in and perform simulations on other objects. Well, within RealFlow, we can actually set objects to either resimulate every time, or we could actually tell it to just go ahead and continue using this cached data every time we try to resimulate. So within RealFlow, if I were to say, like I have this little yellow emitter here with these yellow particles, let's say that I actually am pretty pleased with the movement and the behavior of those particles. However, I'd like to come in and maybe make some adjustments to this set of blue particles. But in order to make those changes, maybe I don't necessarily want to have to re-render or re-simulate these yellow particles, because I already am perfectly happy with the way that these are moving. So to go ahead and retain this simulation information, make sure that that doesn't get overridden, what we can do is take this object with that selected. Let's go up to Node, and right now with this set to Simulation Active, let's pull that down and set that to Cache. Now, if I deselect this, you'll notice that this object over here in our nodes list becomes sort of the same yellowish color as our cached part of the timeline. This is signifying that this object will no longer be resimulated the next time we set up our simulation. Instead, it will rely entirely on this cached information. So now, if I were to come in and make some adjustments to this circle, let's say I increase its resolution to, let's say 10, just for demonstration's sake. And now once again, Control A to reset my timeline. Looks like everything has been reset, but now if I were to reset the simulation, let that go off again, you can see that this square emitter is actually not resimulating itself at all. Instead, it's just relying purely on that cached information that was simulated from some of those earlier frames. And really, this is something that can very, very significantly speed up our simulation. So if we had things like rigid bodies or soft body objects that are maybe bouncing around and being driven by RealFlow's internal gravity and movement management, we can actually come in here, and once we get the movement set up just right, we can actually cache that out and then tell RealFlow now every time we replay, just reuse that same cached information instead of having to resimulate that all over again. And then we can start to add things like fluids and other behaviors directly on top of that. So the thing that we need to be aware of, though, is that sometimes this can become a little bit confusing, especially if you set an object to maybe be cached, but maybe you accidentally forget about it. So if I were to take my cube here, rather my square emitter, and set its resolution to something like 10, you can see that once I resimulate this, it has not actually updated anything on this particular emitter. You can see we still have the exact same number of particles compared to this emitter over here. So keep in mind that because this object is set to cached, that none of these changes that we make will have any influence whatsoever, because again, this is all just reading the stored information from our previous simulation. So if you make some changes and then you decide to actually implement those, we just need to make sure that now we take that emitter and turn its cache off, and instead just set it back to an active simulation. Now, we can actually do this now in RealFlow 2012 with these little buttons right up here. I sort of call these the stoplight buttons. We have this green, yellow, and red. So green, means this object will be active. If I set it to yellow, that's the same as setting it to a cached mode. And again, you can see that the object over here in my node list turns yellow. And the last one that we have is inactive. So if I set an object to be inactive, now if I were to come in and reset my simulation and let that play through, you can see this emitter right back in here, which you can barely see at this point, is really just, as the name suggests, completely inactive. So this is actually sort of a useful way of maybe having a couple of different emitters set up in your scene. Maybe each one has slightly different settings, and you can now turn certain emitters on or off and test variations in your settings without having to worry about actually losing or having to remember the previous settings in other emitters and things like that. Alright, so that's a look at how we can start to take certain bits of simulation information and then actually ensure that that information is retained for any previous or any new simulations that we perform from this point forward.